This is a key moment for the country. Too often in our history, we've seen religion used to justify attacks on other people's rights, from slavery to Jim Crow to women's right to vote. That same fight is with us today, and we can't let it stand.
Gee, do you wonder if MSNBC hired Al Sharpton because of his legal scholarship? Yet there was the Reverend Sharpton on MSNBC yesterday comparing Indiana's religious freedom law to slavery and Jim Crow. Boy, that's a good subject for our panel. Let's bring him in. On the right, the author of the book Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again, radio host Steve Deace, who is Skyping in from Des Moines, Iowa. And joining us from Newsmax, Washington, on the left, Stephen Cobb, the former General Counsel for the Democratic Party of Virginia. Steve, you're the lawyer. Make the legal case. How on earth was this religious freedom law out of line in Indiana?
Well, there's two things that are unique to the law that was in Indiana. First, it extended the comparison from other of the acts and the federal acts around the country to private citizens and private businesses, as opposed to those that were primarily churches or nonprofits. That was new. And the second thing that the Indiana law did was that it didn't make a requirement or explicitly state to the contrary that the government didn't have to be a defendant. So what this did was it was allowing religious justification in private litigation that could lead to the possible discriminatory action. And this is something that I think Governor Pence alluded to today in his press conference by requesting that additional language be added to that legislation to prevent private citizens from using that law as a means of discrimination.
Steve Deace, your take.
Well, you'll forgive me, JD, if I don't want to be lectured to about human rights from a scam artist, liar, proven liar, repeatedly, a guy who incites race riots for a living, still hasn't paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes, and believes in dismembering babies. So if you think, I just don't want to be lectured to on human rights from the likes of Al Sharpton and people like him. Really, this comes down to a few questions that no one wants to answer, so I'll ask them anyway. Should someone be able to walk into a Christian baker and demand that they bake them a cake that says "Piss Christ" on it? Should someone be able to walk into a Jewish baker and say, hey, you've got to bake me a cake with a swastika on it, otherwise you've violated my civil rights? Do we tell kosher deli owners that they have to handle and serve non-kosher foods, otherwise that is discrimination against Gentiles? Do we tell black people they have to serve white supremacist conferences, otherwise they're guilty of discrimination? Do we walk into a homosexual print shop owner and say, you know what, if you don't make those hate-mongering shirts for Westboro Baptist Church, well, you have violated their civil rights? This is utterly and totally preposterous. This is the worst media-contrived hysteria, JD, since the last one, Hands Up, Don't Shoot. This is all about one thing only: control. Statists want control, and what they really hate is the church in America saying that the state is not God, government is not God, only God is God. They don't believe in religious freedom. They don't believe in God-given rights. Frankly, they don't believe in the principles that America was built upon, which just 20 short years ago, President Clinton cited in the White House when he signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act into law.
Yeah, and speaking of that federal statute, Stephen, that law was drafted up by Chuck Schumer, among others. And was it language all that explicit about gay rights? I don't believe so. You've got 30 seconds to answer that, Stephen.
Well, again, the two parts that I talked about, one, the use for private litigants as opposed to nonprofits and churches wasn't there, and the explicit language carving out the need for a government actor wasn't there. The federal legislation was done in response to the Native American use of peyote and wasn't being used as a reason to justify private discrimination.
But now...
Notice none of those questions were answered, JD. None of those questions were answered because there's one thing statists don't ever want to do: put a limit on government control over anything.
Unfortunately, we have a limit right now, a four-letter word called time. But gentlemen, we're going to ask you to stay right there, maybe go to your respective corners, and we'll come back with more political pugilism from our political panel as America's Forum continues.
So what you get is that incredibly awkward stonewalling by Mike Pence yesterday, where he cannot answer a simple question whether or not the state of Indiana should be able to discriminate against gays and lesbians. This puts him in the same position as George Wallace was a generation ago by saying that, you know what, I'm not in favor of segregation. I never have been. This is about states' rights and the Constitution. So you elevate the ugly to try to remain politically pure in it.
Well, John Evlon, the Daily Beast editor-in-chief on CNN, sounded kind of like Al Sharpton earlier. Of course, Mike Pence came out earlier. You saw it right here on America's Forum, the governor of Indiana, asking the General Assembly to offer clarifying language to the religious freedom law that he signed last week, making it clear that it would not allow a business to have a right to discriminate. Let's continue with our political panel. Again, on the left, the former General Counsel for the Democratic Party of the state of Virginia, or the Commonwealth of Virginia, Stephen Cobb. And on the right, the author of the book, Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again, nationally syndicated talk show host Steve Deace, Skyping in from Des Moines. Steve Deace, you hear John Avlon again, the politicizing what seems to be a fairly straightforward legal question. Are people trying to just eliminate Mike Pence and his national ambitions?
Well, I think Mike Pence probably just did that himself with the press conference you guys just aired, JD. But I find it interesting, an industry whose very success depends upon the original intent of the First Amendment remaining true, seemingly wants to skip past that whole part about religious freedom and that exact same First Amendment. The question still stands. Can government make you change your religious beliefs? Can government order you to do something that violates your own conscience? Can it make a Christian baker? Can a government force a Christian baker to make a cake that says "Piss Christ"? Can government force a Jewish baker to make a cake that has a swastika on it? Can it force a black
And let's see if let's go to
supremacists?
Stephen Cobb, because you set out a litany of questions. And Counselor, can you answer those questions about ensuring religious liberties? The very objectionable things that Steve Deace brought forward that he believes this religious freedom statute deals with.
Well, to make a point, those were 5 questions, not 1 question. And what we're talking about here is the particular language used in a statute, and whether or not it is so over-inclusive to permit or otherwise justify private discrimination. I hope we can all agree that states should not be passing legislation that promotes or protects discrimination. This is a bad thing. This shouldn't be an issue of the left versus the right. This is something that we should all condemn as poor legislation. And so Mike Pence, you're absolutely right, couldn't answer the basic question of whether or not this allowed discrimination, and went on television this morning to call for a fix for that poor language. I hope that the Indiana legislature takes this seriously and makes the appropriate legislative amends so that it does not give private individuals a state-protected right to discriminate.
Final 30 seconds for you, Steve Deace. Go ahead. Go ahead, Steve.
That's all lawyers speak for yes. We do think the state gets to tell you to change your religious beliefs. It's funny, all the people who say they're against discrimination seem to be for all forms of discrimination if it upholds traditional morality, Judeo-Christian belief in the Bible, Christianity, particularly of the conservative variety. This is exactly what this is about, JD. The reality is, listen, I'll just say it point blank. People like Stephen are all liars. They're all just lying.
Okay.
They've been lying all this time when they promised us that redefining marriage freedom wouldn't cost anybody else their freedom.
Fairness compels me. Let me let Stephen Cobb. Let me let Stephen Cobb have 15 seconds. Go ahead, Stephen Cobb.
JD, I mean, responding to rants and being called a liar, I'm just not going to sink to that level. It's silly, hyperbolic language that doesn't help a serious debate about serious legislation. I'm just not going to go there.
Well, I will tell you both, gentlemen.
Stephen, you haven't answered any questions I've asked at all. You've obfuscated just like Mike Pence. You haven't answered anything at all. You haven't told the truth about what you really believe.
Gentlemen, I appreciate it. Steve Deace, Stephen Cobb, thank you very much. Obviously, this brings a great deal of passion to our discussion, and we appreciate your time. That's going to do it for us today here on America's Forum. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Stay brave, stay free, stay tuned.